Our speaker today, Michael Bamberger, is someone that left the World Bank, I think, with about 22 years of experience. And I got to know Mike when he was a gender specialist, one of the many hats he wore in his World Bank career. I think he was there 1 or 2 years before he retired. But he's another case of us where, retirement didn't work. It just didn't work for Mike Bamberger. And I sometimes see his schedule of jetting around the world and wonder how he keeps up. We've worked together. He's been at IPDET many, many years as a key workshop provider, sometimes doing different workshops as his interests may change over time, and always delivering a solid performance and leading us into consideration of new aspects of evaluation that we may not have thought much about, or leading us into actually new directions of, for example, how to evaluate complexity in complex programs. So he very much has challenged our thinking and our learning over the years. Mike continues. As I said, he's very active now, and I know we've worked together in part revising the curriculum for evaluation specialists and generalist staff at USAID, which is, of course, the United States development aid organization. Michael has also been active and done training as well as evaluations throughout most of the continents, I guess Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East. In his spare time, he has served on several on the boards or review boards of several evaluation journals, and also does various writings and presentations throughout the year. So he's, I think, speaking today on another topic that may be one that, again, not enough attention has been given to, and I think, knowing Michael's past, that his talk will be informative as well as enjoyable. So without further ado, I ask you to join me in giving Michael a real IPDET 2012 welcome. Michael, thank you.
So, bonjour, monsieur, dame. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you, and listening to Linda's introduction, I come to the conclusion, actually quite a long time ago, that I'm too old to be able to retire. It's too hard work, retirement, so I don't think I'll try it. So what I wanted to share with you this afternoon are a few thoughts on something which has been, keeps coming up in my work, and which has been bothering me, and that is that while everybody knows that projects and programs almost never work out exactly as you planned them, it always seems to come as a surprise to evaluators when this happens. And also, there are just many, many important unintended consequences which evaluators never even seem to spot. So I want to talk, and I hope at the end that you'll say this is complete nonsense, that you always really know all of the consequences of your programs and you've got them all monitored and nothing ever comes as a surprise to you. So what I want to just talk a little bit about is trying to understand why it is that evaluation has this blind spot, that evaluation designs are not very good at detecting unanticipated consequences, many of which can have some very dramatic effects, often negative, for the populations affected by the project. So I'm just going to think a little bit of why this happens, what is it that about evaluation design and theory which often makes it difficult to detect unintended consequences. Why does this matter? And then just a few thoughts about what, if anything, can we do about this. So the first point, which is not a surprise to most people, is that development programs almost never work out as planned. One of the very fundamental reasons is that we're mainly working in complex situations, and we're developing simple interventions to try to address very complex issues like poverty, conflict, vulnerability, social equality, and we very frequently come in with a relatively simple intervention, microcredit, providing water supply, and so it's almost inevitable that many things are going to not work out as we've planned, because our project is only addressing one dimension of a very complex situation. So this is a first fact. And then another one which evaluators often forget is that planners and evaluators have very little influence, particularly evaluators, very little influence over how programs are designed. So the kinds of evaluations you can do, what you can capture, is also limited by a whole range of factors. So for these reasons, very basic reasons, it's not a surprise that most development interventions have unintended consequences. They don't work out the way that we thought they would. And, but this still catches evaluators by surprise. There's so many programs which are being evaluated where very important deviations occur from the project, and evaluators either hadn't anticipated this, or in a number of cases they don't even realize it's happened. So I'd be thinking just a little bit about why this might be the case. And so just to give a couple of examples of why this matters, I was looking at a Food for Work program in Nicaragua, and many women, their lives were significantly improved by being able to start a small business with the money they were getting from the Food for Work program and some small grants. So all of the women who came along to the meetings, they were really enthusiastic about the program. It had had a very dramatic effect on their lives. And the project implementing agency was very, very happy, because this is what they expected would happen. However, when we dug a little bit deeper, we found that firstly, there's a lot of women would have liked to participate in the project, and their husbands or their families didn't allow them to. The evaluation didn't capture this. They just focused on the people who had participated. But even more seriously and more worrying, quite a few women ended up in hospital, seriously beaten up, because they wanted to participate in the project without their husband's permission. So the husband felt humiliated, he felt annoyed. His wife is supposed to get his permission before she participates in a project. And the evaluation didn't capture this at all. The evaluation was just talking to the beneficiaries, who were very happy with the project. The husbands came along, they were so happy their wife was able to earn more money. And the project, firstly, didn't capture the fact many women who would have liked to participate didn't, but there was these very dramatic, very sometimes almost tragic unintended consequences of domestic violence as a result of the project, which wasn't even captured, didn't come into the evaluation reports. Now, I'm not saying for a moment that evaluators can't detect those things, because obviously they can, but there's just many examples you come across where it was a surprise to them, and often it didn't even get captured. Another example we were talking about in the workshop this morning, there was a slum upgrading project in the Philippines, in the Tondo foreshore, and the project made some very dramatic improvements in the lives of the families in the community, better houses, access to water and sanitation. What the evaluation didn't capture was that 1 to 2 years before the program officially began, people who had political contacts started buying up the land and forcing out poor people. So the people who were actually getting a lot of benefit from this project were the higher or middle income groups and not the poor. But this happened before the evaluation began. The evaluation, again, didn't capture this. So the evaluation said the program had been very successful because the people who were there when they did the baseline study were still there 3 years, 5 years later. They got better houses, they had better health, and they didn't mention that many of these were not the people that the project was intended for. Again, an unintended consequence which the evaluation didn't capture. So one could go on. There's many examples like this which can be quite serious. And so if evaluations are not capturing these consequences, it's something that we should be concerned about. So and again, I'm not saying that evaluations can't do this. They certainly can, but any of you who've heard any of my previous presentations, you know I like to go and pull people's tails a little bit and overstate slightly the case, but it is a very serious and quite widespread issue. So why do evaluations find it hard to detect these outcomes? A first reason is that funders want to hear about how successful their programs have been. They're quite happy to hear things which haven't gone well with their project, but they want the evaluation to focus on their project. And very often people who benefit from a project, who actually get the services, they're better off. Not always, but very often they are. So the feedback that the funders often get is that the program is going pretty well, people are pretty happy, and they don't feel any great drive to go and dig deeper and to find out about the people who didn't benefit. And so many evaluators learn after a few tries to do this that they're beating their heads against a brick wall in many cases if they start saying we need more time and money, we need to go and investigate the people who are not benefiting from the project. So the funders, in many cases, again, not all, but many funders are quite happy that the results are coming out reasonably positive, and they're not forcing the evaluators to dig deeper. They often don't give them the resources or the time to dig deeper. And we've all heard, we want a really objective evaluation, but this is not the moment to rock the boat because our negotiations with the government are a little bit sensitive. There's also the real-world constraints of budget, time, lack of access to data, organizational and political constraints. So there's a lot of practical factors which are limiting the ability to detect unanticipated consequences. But also, if we look at evaluation designs, they must take quite a bit of the responsibility. If you look at theories of change and logic models, theories of change are very much in fashion at the moment. A lot of those are designed to explain how the intended project outcomes are going to be achieved. They don't talk about all of the other things which might happen which are not related to the project. So if you look at many theories of change, and particularly logic models, they're explaining the inputs, outputs, outcomes, all around, are we reducing infant mortality? Are we increasing school enrollment? And the theory is just very often not focusing on other things which might be happening, which were not intended and which were not the concern of the implementing agency. Theories of change could look at these things, but in practice, very often they don't. They're just saying, this is the program's theory, how it's going to produce these results. We're going to test this theory, look at the linkages, and see whether the results are achieved. Results frameworks, the same. Results frameworks are just tend to be measuring, are you achieving the results? A results framework doesn't tend to have a column, how many women suffered from domestic violence because of your microcredit program. So a lot of these things just don't come onto the radar screen of a lot of accountability or oriented evaluations. Then if you look at many quantitative evaluation designs, you do your pre-test with your comparison group and the project group. You come back at the end of the project and you measure whether has there been a statistically significant increase in the outcome variable you're interested in, comparing the two groups, and if there is, this shows the project has probably had some impact. They don't have any mechanism in many of the surveys for looking at unintended consequences. It's just not, again, on the radar screen of a lot of the quantitative evaluation designs. They could, but very often they don't look at those. Structured surveys collect information relevant to program objectives, but rarely provide opportunities for respondents to talk about other things which are of concern to them. They could, but they tend not to. A lot of people who are doing the data analysis get very unhappy if you have a lot of open-ended questions. It's very difficult to code them and put them into your data analysis. So you're not encouraged to write on the questionnaire, oh, by the way, this person said they're really worried about the increase in domestic violence or the gangs. If that's not part of your project, you're not encouraged to talk about that. Then using a lot of evaluation methodologies, particularly quantitative, it's difficult to interview vulnerable groups, the people who are most likely not to benefit from your project or to suffer from it. And I'll give a couple of examples of why that happens in a moment. Then also focus groups, which are one of the most widely used qualitative or semi-quantitative methods. Very often, the way focus groups are selected in practice is they tend to be the people who are involved in the project, who are benefiting from it. The people who don't benefit, who may have suffered, tend not to end up in most focus groups. They could, but focus groups are very often organized in a rush, and the people who are most likely to come are the ones closest to the project. This doesn't have to happen, but I, like many people, have looked at many focus groups which are really not a very representative sample of some of the sectors you'd like to look at. Evaluations often ignore the context in which the program is operating, the political, economic, environmental consequence. So often the things which cause some of these unintended consequences often don't get captured. Then finally, one of the consequences of budget constraints is it's very often it's more expensive and time-consuming to interview the people who live further away from the center of the community. I was looking at a literacy program in the north of Vietnam, and the Hmong was one of the ethnic minorities there. It was 4 or 5 hours walk to get to them, and so the people who do an evaluation said we'd have loved to go and evaluate the Hmong, how they were affected by the project. Unfortunately, our budget and our time didn't allow us to do that. So the most vulnerable group, the one who was most likely not to be benefiting from the project, they didn't get interviewed because it was too expensive and time-consuming. So we've already mentioned why we should worry about this. Some of these unanticipated consequences seriously affect the project efficiency and effectiveness. Important lessons are not learned. Vulnerable and voiceless groups tend not to benefit, and their problems get ignored. And some groups can even be significantly worse off. So what can we do about this? I want to thank my colleague Johnny Morell, who's written a very interesting book on evaluation in the face of uncertainty, which I've drawn upon in the next section. And he and I are hoping to give a workshop together on this in a think tank at the American Evaluation Association. So what can be done? There are different kinds of surprises that we should understand. Some of them could be anticipated and addressed. For example, we know some of the reasons that if you give a loan for a small business, why a small business doesn't start. That's relatively well known and can be anticipated. There's other things that could be planned for and detected. Some of these contextual factors, often it's not, but they could be. And then there are some kind of surprises it would be very difficult to anticipate, like a tsunami. Then the magnitude of the surprise is related to a number of factors, like how innovative a project is. If it's going into a lot of new territory, it's more likely that there'll be surprises. Some kind of interventions, if you're building a road, there may be less unanticipated consequences than if you're trying to promote complex mechanisms of behavioral change. How closely the project implementation complies with its design protocol, again affects how well you understand the context. The more you understand, the more likely you are to capture these consequences. how robust the project is to operating in different situations, and the time between the intervention and when you do the evaluation. The longer the time, the more unanticipated consequences. So a few things just to wrap up that can be done to try to address these unanticipated consequences to using theory-based evaluation, where there's more of a focus on the context and the mechanisms, where you're using your theory to help you identify unanticipated outcomes which you need to try to detect. So theory-based evaluations is a very valuable tool if it's used properly. The systematic use of past experience, learning from what has happened before, which a lot of evaluators don't do, so that's obviously important. Breaking down the evaluation into smaller segments, each of which it's easier to anticipate the outcomes, and then putting the whole thing together again. The kind of forecasting methods which are being used by program planners can be helpful for anticipating some of these outcomes. Broadening the role of monitoring, so it's not just putting numbers in boxes, but it's being used actively to identify when things are getting off track, and to spot them and to try to look at them as quickly as you can. So a more dynamic kind of monitoring. Then there's the two final points are what Johnny Morell calls Agile evaluation. And I've added having a plan B, of always thinking what's going to happen if the project doesn't work out the way that we've planned, or that you can't do the baseline study the way you thought. So having an alternative plan, so it doesn't come to you as a surprise when the evaluation changes. When the program changes, you've got your evaluation strategy ready. Flexibility in terms of data collection. If the way you're planning to collect data, you can't have an alternative way of getting the data. Having flexible evaluation designs that you can rapidly adapt as circumstances change, the target population changes, the range of services. Be ready to address these. Unpacking programs into separate components which can be more easily analyzed individually. Constantly reviewing your program theory. A program theory is not a beautiful document which you do and then put in a drawer. You should be constantly coming back and checking your assumptions to see whether things have changed and what the implications are. Plan B, being prepared for things which are not working out as you've expected with the evaluation. What happens if the program begins before you've done your baseline study? Do you have an alternative plan? What happens if your comparison group vanishes? It gets integrated into the project, it's flooded, there's an urban renewal, it's a highway 2 years later. How are you going to adapt to that? How are you going to get an alternative comparison group? What happens if the program's restructured? It starts giving completely different services to different groups of people. Are you prepared for that, and how will you address it? If the essential data is not available, do you just sit in a corner and cry, or do you think of another way you can go out and get the data? What happens if the data is being intentionally withheld from you? How do you address that? Then finally, this is the final slide, eyes wide open evaluation. Knowing what is really happening on the ground. There are many program evaluations where everybody in the country except the evaluator knows about the political dynamics, that there's a conflict developing, that just all sorts of things are happening, corruption, the road is going to be rerouted because of some political pressures. So making sure that you know what everybody else in the country knows. Find out what critical events have taken place before the evaluation begins. Develop diverse sources of information within and outside the program, so that you've got a lot of people feeding you information on what is really happening. Check who you're getting information from and who you're not meeting, which is very, very critical. Certain people that the government is setting up meetings for you, and mysteriously these people never are available. You need to be spotting that and thinking of alternative ways of getting the data. If you're using things like focus groups, make sure you know who is in the focus group. How did they get there? Were they appointed by the government? Did they come because to complain about the project? Making sure you know who they are. And then finally, develop creative ways to get information on and about non-beneficiaries and the groups who are worse off. You should always begin assuming, this is the final point, you should always begin by assuming that it's very likely some groups are going to be benefiting less and some groups may be worse off, and it's always the most vulnerable groups, the poorest, the voiceless, the women, the ethnic minorities, are the ones who are likely to be worse off, the ones you may not be getting information from. So always use an eyes wide open evaluation so you don't find yourself in the embarrassing situation that at the end of your evaluation, everybody else knew that the program has been completely changed because of political maneuverings, and the evaluator was the only person in the country who didn't know any of this. So keep your eyes open, and I hope that a few of these points might be useful to you and make a few people occasionally stay awake at night worrying about, were there some things that we didn't know about in our evaluation. So thank you.
My name is Lee Cho from IEG at the World Bank. In my organization, we have rigid budgeting process. We have standard design and sort of standard product. I'm afraid we miss out on most of the unanticipated consequences or unanticipated emergence, as I learned from Michael Patton this morning. My question is, what advice you would give to the World Bank or similar organization so that they would loosen up to some extent and try to capture some of the unexpected events or something like Arab Spring, for example. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for this rich presentation. I have actually two questions. My first question is related to the causality between this unexpected, unanticipated events and the program itself. So, because sometimes we look often to make the causality between the impact and the program, but can we make this the same, looking for the same causality between the program and this unexpected events? Because sometimes it seems that the program was the cause, but finally, with analyzing things deeply, we can find that finally it's not directly the program who causes these events. And we can take the example for domestic violence with the microcredit programs, that yes, we can, if just really discuss it, you can find that finally we should ask the question, if the program didn't happen, is the domestic violence would not have happened. So this is my second question related to the Plan B that you actually mentioned, and my question is, should we have a Plan B, all the unexpected events, and have Plan B for all these questions? Because it's like when we travel by car, yes, we can have additional tire, additional some pieces, but we cannot bring a second car, especially if we have one driver. So this is the question. Can we just really prioritizing these questions? Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question regarding, I loved your slide at the beginning, and acknowledging the constraints of speaking about some of these unintended outcomes and, don't rock the boat, that sort of thing. And I'm wondering, when you're kind of like, what can we do? It's more about how to uncover unanticipated outcomes. But assuming you've uncovered them, do you have anything to comment on how one might present them?
Thank you.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry, I forgot that part. I'm Tricia Vanderkoy here from CETA in Ottawa.
Okay. Well, thank you. Some very interesting questions. I thought you were only going to be asking me easy questions. So the question from IEG, and my comments are not just related to IEG. It's a very common thing. I've worked with a lot of bilaterals and UN agencies and multilaterals. It's very common that you have sometimes you have an evaluation policy which states your approach, that we do all of our evaluations at the end of the project, and there are different kind of approaches and guidelines, and sometimes what kind of data you would use is, we've been working with people like USAID, and they have a very strong preference for certain kinds of quantitative data rather than others, so they can do proper evaluations. So these kinds of constraints are there, and One of the things which I think is very useful is working with the terms of reference for the evaluation, particularly when you're working under constraints of budget and time, to require whoever's doing the evaluation, the consultants or in-house, require that there are certain things that they have to look at. That, for example, even if you're doing a very rapid evaluation with only a few days in the field, the evaluator has to come up with some way of identifying the groups who are not benefiting from the project and identifying some of the unintended consequences. Now, if you can find some unintended consequences which are positive as well, that would be really great. So you don't get the image of just being, this sort of bad guy. But just requiring the evaluators, when they submit their proposal, they can't just say, we've only got 3 days in Jakarta. They have to say, well, we're going to try to identify key informants. We think there's some kinds of secondary data which should be available. We're going to talk to the NGOs. We're going to do some kind of spending more time in one of the communities. We're going to hire a local researcher to help us. But however you do this, they have to come up with a methodology of how they're going to be identifying the groups who are not benefiting. So you can't just go to a village and just talk to the ladies who participated in the project. That would just not be acceptable. You wouldn't get paid. You haven't complied with your terms of reference. So that's probably the sort of very basic thing to be done. But the key challenge, which I come across as many of you do, you bring all of these things up to the funding agencies, and they nod. You're completely right. We completely agree with you. However, let me explain a little bit about our organization, and then they basically say none of these could be done here. And well, if the administrative structure is too limiting for you to do the evaluation, why don't you go and talk to somebody? Well, that would be difficult, and I don't think my boss would like it. So I've never been in an organization where they've said, no, we don't care about any of these things, go away. They always nod, this is really great, but unfortunately, in our organization, we can't do any of them. So how you get an incentive for the organization to worry about these things is a challenge, and particularly if the things you're finding tend to be negative. If your standard evaluation, things are going pretty well, and then if you go deeper, if you find things are not going very well, what incentive would the organization have to worry about that, other than the basic fact that most organizations, their basic statement of objectives is to do no harm. And so if you're doing some very serious harm, maybe you should be worrying about it. But just trying to find a way that you could encourage organizations, the tools of how you would do it are, a lot of things are very well known to evaluators. The second question on looking at the relationship between your intervention and the unanticipated consequences, this is obviously a very useful expansion of the theory of change. There's a very big literature about what is likely to happen if you have any project which is promoting women's empowerment. You know different kinds of things are going to be happening. If you're investing in public works projects, you know that there's going to be incentives for people to try and make a private profit out of this. So you could build a lot of these things into your theory of change. So a lot of these events are unrelated to your project. The fact there was a tsunami is not the fault of you building your project. So how many plan Bs should you have? What you're trying to do is to identify the things which are very likely to happen. For example, it's almost a rule that in a very high percentage of projects, the project will begin before the baseline study gets done. My guess would be in 75% maybe of projects, the project begins before the baseline study gets done, because there's great incentives to start handing out the money, and the services, there's no incentive to hurry along and do the baseline study. So that's one of the things you know is likely to happen, so you should have a plan B on that. You know that the implementation design is going to change. You need to have a plan B for that. And so just basically drawing on your experience from the past of what are the things most likely to happen, and have this, your reactions ready of how to, control groups are always vanishing, how do you address that? So basically you're looking at the things which are most critical. Then the point about introducing the unanticipated consequences, that's something which I already touched upon a little bit. What you'd like to do strategically is the first time you convince the agency to look at unanticipated consequences, try strategically to find a project where some of these consequences may be positive. Because if all of your evaluations show, this program's going much worse than everybody else thought, you're very quickly going to lose enthusiasm. But if you show, for example, that a group was set up to try to organize a microcredit program, maybe it didn't work very well on microcredit, but they started setting up a health center. So if you find some positive things, people say, hey, we really should like to look at these. So strategically, try to give the image that looking at these things is just not going to be causing headaches for the organization, which is difficult because a lot of them, there are bad things which they don't know about and should. But try to make it as sort of positive and as useful as you can. So I'll stop there and hope these were a few useful thoughts. So.
Well, I hope you found that provocative in a good sense of thought-provoking. Many of you who took the core, many of you who have had a mini IPDET before, should find some of this resonating. It should resonate with you in the way we talk about theory of change, the way we talk about looking for not just the winners, but looking at those who lose from an intervention. I think part of the contribution of Michael's presentation today is that I myself have not seen this drawn together so comprehensively in terms of the problems and the issues and some of the strategies that can be used to address some of these issues. So once again, thank you, or join me in thanking Michael. And Michael, don't quite go. So I want to say thank you to you once again for